Hey y'all, it's actually Bookishrealm and I'm back with another video. So as you can tell from the title of this video, I am going to be talking about my favorite and worst books of 2022 so far based on my reading in quarter number 1. So I've read over 100 books so far this year, and I am not counting anything that I am currently reading in April. This is all from January, February, March. So I had a lot of things that I had to choose from, and I was very surprised at the things that ended up becoming my favorites, and not so surprised about the things that I did not really end up enjoying. So before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about today's sponsor, and that is a Book of the Month. So thank you so much to them for sponsoring this video. If you did not know, Book of the Month is a fast-growing online book service that is dedicated to helping readers discover books that they're going to love. Their mission is to promote new and emerging authors, and the way that Book of the Month typically works is that they spend the month vetting through hundreds of books to come up with a specially curated list of selections for people to choose from. That way they can spend less time researching and more time reading. One of the things that I absolutely love about Book of the Month is that they have so many different genres to choose from. It's a little bit of everything for everyone, whether you like historical fiction, romance, literary fiction. Sometimes there's even some YA titles in there. Book of the Month is also really cool at being risk-free. So if there's ever a month that you do not like the selection, you could always skip and you won't be charged for that month. In addition to that, they have the best prices for newly released hardcovers. So basically, you know that hardcovers here in the US, especially adult hardcovers, can run up a pretty hefty price. But for Book of the Month, you can get your first book for $9.99 this month by using the code Bookishrealm. I'll be sure to leave that code and the link to Book of the Month in the description box below. So every month your books will come in this blue Book of the Month box. They also have these really cute bookmarks. This month's bookmark is Use Me or Lose Me. So the first one that we have here is The Good Left Undone. It takes place during World War II and is centered on the concept of family. The next one that we have here is Kaiki, and this is a novel that centers on a young woman who does not believe that boys should have all the fun and attempts to find her place in history. The next is a nonfiction title, which is Bittersweet: How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole, which is one that I'm really interested in picking up. I think this is definitely good for individuals who are really in tune with those emotions, like when you watch a commercial and it makes you really sad. This is a great pick for individuals like that, and that individual that I'm talking about is me. The next one is one that I am super excited for. I am currently on the wait list for this one at my library, so I'm happy to have a physical copy of it, and it is Like a Sister. This focuses on a young woman whose sister unexpectedly passes away, so she decides to take on the case herself. And the last one that we have here is True Biz, which is a story that focuses on essentially like the true business of a school that was designed and built for the deaf. All right, y'all, so those are the April picks for Book of the Month. Like I said before, if you are interested in signing up and getting your first book for $9.99, the code that you can use for this month is Bookishrealm, and I will make sure I leave the code and the link down below in the description box. Thank you so much to Book of the Month for sponsoring this video. Okay, y'all, so let's go ahead and dive into essentially the books that I'm going to be talking about. I only picked 5 for each category because I didn't want this list to be like super excessive or long. So I did 5 of the best books and then 5 of the worst books. So the first book that I have on the best books is I Must Betray You by Rita Sepetys. This is one that I was definitely looking forward to. I have read Rita Sepetys before and really enjoyed her work, and I was excited that she was coming up with this one. This specifically focuses on the Romanian Revolution that takes place in 1989, and it centers itself on a young man who ends up becoming an informer for the communist regime that is in his country at the time. It is such a powerful and insightful book that really captures a lot of history that I think a lot of people are unaware of. I know that I didn't really know much about the Romanian Revolution until after I ended up reading this book. I thought it was extremely powerful. It was heartbreaking, and it's amazing like what happens afterward. I know that I had a viewer who commented, who I believe is from Romania, and gave me even further insight to the book. It was just one that I knew that I was going to like, but I didn't realize I was going to go in and actually like love it as much as I did. One of the benefits of this book is that it's told in like short vignettes, or I should say more like short chapters, not vignettes. It's told in short chapters, which means that it feels like the book is extremely long in some ways, but then not in some ways, because it's such great storytelling that you don't realize how long it is until you're like on chapter like 95. You're like, wow, this is a lot of chapters. But just keep in mind that the chapters are really, you know, short, and I just absolutely ate this book up. I cannot wait to dive into more of Ruta Sepetys' work. If you're looking for a chunk of history that you probably are not going to see that often in young adult, I would highly recommend picking that one up. The next one that I have on this list is one that I'm very surprised that I ended up enjoying so much, not because it wasn't a good story or that it didn't have good marketing or that it didn't sound good. It's that it is a fantasy book, and I am not a huge fantasy and sci-fi reader, but I made it my goal this year to read more fantasy and sci-fi. So I picked up Daughter of the Moon Goddess, which I think quite a few people have read and have really enjoyed. Now, what's interesting about this one is that I have seen the author say that this is a great kind of like in between for people who enjoy fantasy but are not quite out of YA but not quite into adult. So it's like that in between kind of section, which I thought was interesting. I know that my library, we actually classify it as adult fantasy, so I'm really interested in hearing more people review and talk about this book and what kind of age category they would put it into. But Daughter of the Moon Goddess is about a young woman who is the daughter of the moon goddess, and she technically is not supposed to exist, and she has to escape her place that she's living with her mom because of the fact that she's not supposed to exist. So she goes to this other kingdom, and she ends up befriending the prince, and she ends up joining the military. And this is definitely one of those books that has a lot of like military intrigue, a lot of political intrigue, definitely a lot of political intrigue. And one of the things that I absolutely loved about this, and it's not the only thing that I loved about it, but one of the things that definitely stood out to me is that this is a love like triangle of sorts done right. It's not what I was expecting at all, and I usually don't like the way stuff like this plays out, but it played out very nicely. And I'm tiptoeing because I don't want to spoil anything, because there's a huge review that I did not see coming at all. This is one that also has a lovers to enemies trope, which I have never seen before, and I thought it was done very nicely. I think that everything that was done in this book in terms of the relationships between characters was very intentional, and it wasn't done just to move them into the sense of being like devices for the plot. I think that the author did an excellent job at that. It was beautifully written. I love the descriptions. I think that it's going to be exciting to be able to dive into the second book, and the second book I believe is actually coming out later this year. But there was just so much amazing things that were going on. I think that if you like fantasy, I know that this is actually like based on the myth of the moon goddess, but if you like fantasy, you like myths, you kind of like, you know, softer retellings, I definitely would recommend checking this one out. I mean, I am so excited for the second book to come out, and that says a lot for me as someone who is not a hardcore fantasy reader. The next one that I have on my best books is Violetta, and this is by Isabella Allende, and this is my first book by her. I was introduced to Isabella Allende by Yanni, and I have read 2 of her books since then. I actually have the 3rd book of hers that I have currently checked out from the library, and I'm really excited to listen to it. So this is her latest title, and it is about a woman who is basically telling her life story, and she is telling her life story to someone. I know some people have put like who she's telling her life story to in like the reviews. I try not to say who she's telling her life story to, because I feel like in some ways it is a bit of a spoiler, but it does take place from her birth, which is about the same time as the start of the flu pandemic that takes place in the early 1900s, and we follow her all through her life up into the pandemic that we all experience in 2020. So it's 100 years of her life, and you really get to see like the ups and downs of her life, her romances, you know, her becoming a mother. And what I loved about this is that our main character Violetta is so passionate and she's so determined to just be herself, and she doesn't let anything or anyone define her, and that ruffles feathers, and people don't really like that, but I love that about her and I appreciated that about her. And that doesn't mean that she's without faults. She acknowledges when she has been wrong, when she's done things that she shouldn't have done, but I think she's just a passionate person, and I adored just reading about her life. And when it came full circle to the end of the book, I did not realize like how, I don't want to say how heartbreaking it was, but how emotional I got thinking about the course of this woman's life and everything that she had been through and everything that she had experienced, the love, the loss, the triumphs. It was just really beautiful writing, and I ate it up. It was great. It was wonderful. The next one that I have on this list is one that I actually have not talked about on the channel because I never did a February nor a March wrap up, which I'm still debating whether I even want to do those things or not. I don't know. We'll see if that ever ends up happening. I may just not do it because I just haven't felt like doing those wrap ups. So, you know, that's just how life goes sometimes. But one of the graphic novels that I read, or comics that I ended up reading this year, was Stray Dogs. And this is one that I heard a lot about last year when it was coming out issue by issue, and I hadn't had the chance to really read it, but it finally came out in trade and I picked it up. It literally is about this dog who ends up with this new owner, this guy, and she can't really remember much about her previous life with her previous owner, but then things start like flashing back, and she is realizing the connection between her new owner and her previous owner, and she completely freaks out, and she starts talking to the other dogs that are there, and she's like, something's not right about the situation. I need you all to remember like where you've come from and like what happened to your previous owners. And it ends up being so twisted and sick, and it's actually pretty dark, but everything takes place from the perspective of the dogs, and I was not expecting it to be as good as it was. I was really surprised at how dark and twisted it was because the entire thing takes place from the perspective of the dogs, but it was such an interesting and engaging comic book. If you've never heard of Stray Dogs, I highly recommend checking it out. And the last one that I have as one of my best books is definitely going to be Blood on the Tracks. Blood on the Tracks is one of the most fascinating and horrifying manga that I have read thus far in my life. I still haven't gotten to Uzumaki yet by Junji Ito, so that may change, but this one is shockingly disturbing. I literally just finished up volume 3 of this series, and I don't even know where to begin to even talk about it. So I'm including the series on here, but I think within the first quarter I did read volume 1. In this second quarter I would have ended up reading volumes 2 and 3. So I'm kind of stretching here, but not really, because I technically did read the first one in quarter 1. But I am shocked. I'm so shocked at where the series is going. It basically is looking at the relationship between a mother and her son, and something is off about the relationship, not in like a gross or incestuous way, because I don't want people to get that perception. There's something off about the mother, and she's super protective of her son in ways that are unexpected, and it just gets creepier and creepier. I think one of the most fascinating things about this manga is the artwork, is what makes the story so scary, really, honestly. I was about to say creepy, but honestly it makes it scary. It's the story, but the art really makes things feel like this is not right. I think just the way that the mangaka like draws the face of like the mother in certain scenes, and like the face of the son whenever he's reacting to certain things that his mother has done, it just, all of it combined together just makes for a very scary situation. So if you've never heard of Blood on the Tracks, please pick it up, because I literally just put volume 4 and 5 on hold at my library, and I'm excited to dive into them. Okay, so let's dive into the worst books. I know this is like everybody's favorite part, but the worst books of 2022 so far. I have so many more than what I was thinking I would have within quarter one. I have 5 already, which I think for me is a lot going in just to the first quarter of the year, because I think I've kind of honed in on my own reading taste, and I'm usually pretty decent at picking up stuff where like it's at least 3 stars, but I have picked up 5 so far. 1 was a 3-star read, but it was really disappointing. The other 4 were like 2.5 star reads. So the first one that I have on this list is Way the House Husband Volume 5. I have decided not to continue this story. There was some really weird things going on with the translation in Way the House Husband Volume 5 that was really indicative of the kind of stereotyping that I felt is associated with the Black community, and I did not care for it at all in terms of like 2 of our characters become rappers in this one vignette, and just the use of like AAVE, the large jersey t-shirts and stuff like that. I just didn't like the way it was handled necessarily, and I know some people are gonna be like, oh well, you know, rappers were known for wearing stuff like that, but you know, I just don't I don't care. Like I don't care like what historically has been done. Like I just did not like to see that in that manga. I just felt like it was just unnecessary. It had no purpose, it had no point, and I didn't like that the translation then was carried over as being like, you know, we're going to specifically be using AAVE to connect it with rap and hip-hop, and it was kind of like it felt like it was making fun of it. It just didn't sit well with me. I didn't really care for it, so I ended up giving that one 2 stars, and I opted just not to continue the series at all. The next one that I have on my list is one that I have talked about quite a bit, and that is The Other Black Girl. This is one that I think, to be honest with you, most people that I know, especially Black reviewers, pretty much have not liked The Other Black Girl. I did not care for it at all. It is about a young woman who's working in publishing industry, and she is the only Black woman who's in the industry, and then she ends up having a coworker who also ends up being Black, but there's something weird about the situation. There's so much that I could break down and dissect about this book that like I just didn't like. I mean, not even about the fact that I just don't like the way that certain elements were utilized to have a conversation about Black people in workspaces. I also did just not like the structure of the book. When you find out, because there's not really much that you can say about this book without really spoiling, to be quite honest with you, when you get to kind of like the climax of the book, you don't really understand the purpose of the second Black woman who comes into the picture, because her sole purpose of coming in, it was not really like, she wasn't needed at all in the book. If what her purpose was, like as it was defined at the end, like there was no reason for her to step in. And it really, I didn't like the idea that we were kind of buying into this stereotype of Black women having to compete with each other in a workplace, and that there's only room for one of us in a workplace. I don't like that, and that is something I think that has been readily like taught in the past, or something that we've had to deal with in the past, but I just don't feel like that's realistic right now in this day and time. I just don't feel like that's realistic. Like, I work in a profession which 83% of the people who work at librarianship are white, and they're women, and so, you know, it's very rare that you have so many Black women working in the same space when it comes to librarianship, let alone Black men. But I think that there is more bonding that happens because we know that there's not that many of us, as opposed to us feeling like there's only room for one of us. And there's a lot of respectability politics that go into this book, and I feel like it just sets us backwards. I didn't care for the novel as a whole when we're talking about like writing and structure and just the framework of it, but the social commentary like also pissed me off. And I know a lot of people who just did not care for this book. Wasn't my cup of tea. This was a patron book club pick of the month. I did not like it, and I did end up giving it 2 stars. I apologize too if y'all hear birds. It's early in the morning, and you know how that goes with the whole like trying to give you some ambiance thing. So the third book that I have on my list is As Good as Dead, which is the 3rd book in the Good Girl's Guide to Murder trilogy, and I loved the first 2 books. I gave the first book 5 stars, second book 5 stars. The third book was such a huge disappointment. It was still a 3-star read because I think that Holly Jackson is a very gifted like YA thriller writer, and I'm really interested in seeing like what she's going to be doing going forward in her writing career. But this one just did not hit because she did one thing that I don't like that writers do sometimes, and that is they change the whole dynamic of a character to move a plot forward, meaning that your characters become unrecognizable. You've kind of set this precedent for your characters in previous books, but in order to create a plot twist or a new narrative, you completely change the way that your main character functions, and I did not like that at all. I was so very much irritated and really pissed, to be honest with you, with the fact that our main character just did something that was completely like out of pocket and completely like out of character for her, and it changed the entire dynamic of the story. And that's why I feel like she was used to move the plot forward, because of the fact that it all centered, like the second half of the book centered on a decision that our main character makes that normally I don't think she ever would have made. And I was very frustrated by that, and it was very disappointing. It was a letdown. I think that if the writing hadn't been so good and if the storytelling hadn't been so good, I probably would have rated it lower, but I still think it was like solid in terms of the writing style and the rest of the narrative. But it was such a huge letdown for me, and I did not realize, like, so many people were so disappointed by this book, and I was like, whatever. I'm still gonna go into it with high hopes, and it really is a disappointing read. If you've read the first 2 books, they were excellent, and then by the time you get to the third one, it's like, what is going on here? So yeah, not my favorite series ender of all time, to be honest with you. The next one that I have here is The Lost Dreamer, which I was so excited to read this one, and this one was also a huge disappointment for me. I had seen this one last year and was super excited about the release. It is a YA fantasy book that has some inspiration from Mesoamerica, and it focuses on 2 young women, one who's a seer, one who's a dreamer, and basically there are a lot of things that end up going wrong in both of their worlds, and somehow, some way, you start to learn like how they may or may not be connected to each other is told in like their alternating perspectives, and there is a lot of like interesting world building in terms of like the relationships between the women in each one of the main characters' lives. And I think like their abilities are really interesting, and what their abilities are used for was really intriguing. But my god, this book was boring, y'all. It was like it took me forever, first of all, to read it, and I listened to it on audio. So that in itself should tell you, like, okay, I wasn't really feeling this book. I think it took me about a good 10 days at least to read this book, which is not a good thing for me. It usually does not take me that long to listen to a book on audio unless it's particularly long. This was an average length audiobook because it's an average length book, and it took me forever to get through it because it was a drag. I think that our 2 main characters were, like, the way that they were written, their voices were so similar to the point that I couldn't really tell the difference between the 2, and that's extremely disheartening going into a book expecting such distinctive characters, especially because they had 2 different abilities. They're coming from 2 different time periods, and they just read so much alike. There were so many times I had to go back and be like, whose perspective is this from again? I think that the pacing was off. It was extremely slow, and then it's like everything snowballs and happens at the end of the book, and it was confusing. First of all, a lot of the story was confusing, and then everything snowballs at the end of the book, and it was like, nah, like, this is too fast. There's no way that this book is wrapping up like this, and it is, and it just didn't do well. Like, there were a lot of loose strings that weren't tied up at the end. I think that there was this evil presence that really wasn't explained well at all. It just wasn't, it was a disappointing read. I wanted so much more from it, and I just really didn't get it. And I think that when I did do my review of this one, I ended up giving it 2.5 stars. And the last one that I have on my list is Required Reading for the Disenfranchised Freshman, and this one focuses on a main character who is black who goes to a predominantly white institution. Now, I thought that this was going to be interesting because I went to a PWI as a black student, and I had some really great experiences being there, and I also had some very interesting experiences being there because it was a PWI. This book was not what I anticipated it to be. I thought that this was going to be a book that was written readily for black students, and I don't feel like it was. I think that this book, as a lot of conversations have been detailing about just books like this in general, this book falls victim to not really being written for young black collegiates going to a predominantly white institution. This is for white people to understand what it's like to be black and go to a PWI. So reading it as a black person, it's a very weird experience. It is basically like racism one-on-one. This is what it's like to go to a PWI, which is not really true to nature. And that's kind of what irritated me, is that I have 3 degrees. I acquired all of them at a PWI. And yeah, a PWI definitely has its ups and downs and its fair share of racism. It's ingrained. But there's this whole thing about one character, this one white guy, controlling everyone at this school, and it's unrealistic, to be quite honest with you. I think that there are a lot of white privileged kids that get a lot of flexibility at these schools because daddy and mommy have money, but not at the level in which it is described, and it was taken to an extreme to show something, what that something is, outside of trying to hold the hands of white readers to explain to them this is what it's like. I'm not sure, and I think a lot of things just felt forced. There was the use of AAVE, but it didn't feel natural to me. It felt like it was very forced, that it was just dropped in at very awkward moments. Like, it just didn't feel like natural flow of language. I don't know how to explain it, but it just felt like it was a caricature. That's a good way to describe it. I feel like our characters were caricatures to help explain to white people, this is what it's like to be black and go to a PWI. And so a lot of what could have been done with this book gets lost in the wash, and I just didn't enjoy it, y'all. It just wasn't a book for me. I think a lot of black people who read it are going to feel like it's not for them. I was excited to read this one, but I didn't end up enjoying it at all. I still haven't even really written a review for it because I was trying to figure out like how to word a lot of the things that I just said, but yeah, it was a huge disappointment, and when I do read it, I think it's going to be like a 2-star read for me. So yeah, those are the books that were the most disappointing or the worst books so far of Q1. And like I said, I'm surprised to have 5 because it's just 3 months, and to have 5 already is kind of interesting. So I will be doing this, of course, in the middle of the year. I'll be doing it in Q3, and then of course the final one will be a reflection. I don't know if I'll do one for Q4, or if I'll just kind of like, I don't know if I'll just do one for the entire year at the end of this year, but we'll see going forward. But anyway, in the comment box below, let me know what are your best and worst books so far of 2022. As always, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more content from me, click the subscribe button, and I'll be back with another video soon.